Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Hypertrophy Past and Present. I paused for a moment there as I started introducing because Riverside has apparently updated and looks a little bit different. So I was taken a bit off guard, but there we go, working on the fly. Chris, how are you doing this week? You've had a big week.
Yeah, I'm doing well, thanks, Jake. Just yesterday, I recorded the first episode of a new podcast project that I'm doing with Rob Malseri. It's called High Performance Physiology. We're going to do the sports and athletic performance side of things. Obviously, we're doing the bodybuilding stuff here, but we're going to, with Rob, I'm going to cover a bit more on the athletic performance and preparation for sport side of things. Definitely also going to be a little bit shorter. We're going to aim for bite-sized kind of stuff. There's a huge amount of stuff we can go at. So we're doing little kind of half-hour episodes every week, hopefully. But that's going to hopefully come out maybe in a week or so once I've battled with, as you said, Riverside and all the other wonderful technological aids that we have to help us do these things. But my age, it's definitely a battle rather than an enjoyment. So, but yeah, that's the big week. So I'm very excited to get that live. Hopefully it'll be available in, as I say, a week or so.
Very cool. And did you say what the name was?
Yeah. So we're calling the podcast High Performance Physiology, and that's the working title that we've got. Hopefully that'll be what it ends up being called as well, given that I've been introducing it as that. But we'll see what happens. But yeah, very excited to get that live and see how people think about it. So obviously I'll share it on social media as soon as it's available, and I'm looking forward to getting feedback for people who benefit.
I like the title. It ties in well with this HPP, High Performance Physiology, Hypertrophy Past and
Hypertrophy
Present.
Past and Present.
Works
Yeah.
perfectly. I'll assume you did that on purpose, but it sounds like it could have been a bit of a fluke. But yes, anyone who's wondering, obviously we're still continuing on with this podcast as well. It's going to be complimentary. You're going to be covering different topics.
Totally, yeah. Totally
content.
complimentary.
So today we are talking about, should we tell you? We'll tell you in a bit. I'll tell you my plan first and then we'll go from there. But I am going to give something away today. On Instagram, all the time, I get asked, what am I drinking intra-workout? Because I'm always posting a photo of some juice combination thing, some concoction that's got something in it and people know it's got juice and maybe it's got honey and they don't really know what's going on. And I get all these questions about why are you doing that? What are you doing? What's in it? What's the goal? What's the purpose? What is it? And I haven't really told anyone. All I said is this was a very common practice in the silver era. And two people specifically that I know of that talk about some variant of this are Reg Park and Steve Reeves. Now, you're a little bit sick to death with some Reg Park plans at the moment, so I'm not going to give you another Reg for at least a few weeks. But I thought, you know what, I do want to talk about this, and to tie it in, I'm going to use a Steve Reeves plan because Steve does explicitly instruct to use a combination of orange juice and honey. He doesn't say how much. He says, he does say a few spoonfuls of honey, okay? And Reg also says something similar, a few spoonfuls of honey, okay? And mix it in with orange juice and to sip on this during your workout. Now, Reg goes as far as to say, to kind of build it up and claim this is one of the most important things when you're doing I think he talks about it in his bulking plan. And he says, and this I actually find interesting, just as like a little bit of a historical kind of like throwback to what the world might have been like. And he talks about how if you can only afford the juice, just do the juice. If you can afford the honey, you will get far superior results combining the honey with the juice. And I think he even says something like, when he can't afford both, he just has the juice or something like that. But it was interesting, like, oh, honey was a privilege back then. How interesting. I thought it was an interesting thing anyway. So OJ and honey and Steve Reeves, and that's my sort of segue. So this plan from Steve, this is an older plan. So we have covered one before, and the one that we covered before was one that he actually wrote down in a magazine, in a Your Physique magazine in 1952. And he says that this was his favorite routine. It was the fourth episode that we covered this on. And it is one of my favorite silver era routines as well. And he does claim in that routine that was one that he had used when he won his biggest accomplishment. Steve, obviously Mr. Universe winner. He was 1950 Mr. Universe winner. Like the second Mr. Universe, we had the first one in 1948. John Grimmick won that. And then there was like a year off, and then it kind of got rebranded and came back in 1950 and Steve won. So Steve, obviously super influential in the silver era. Also became an actor in Hercules movies. I don't know what other movies. I haven't actually seen any of his movies. I'm embarrassed to admit. But anyways, yeah, he claims he used that workout at that period in time. And the workout we're going to talk about today was actually predated that. So he used this one in 1949, I believe he says. Now, one thing I do need to mention about this particular workout is this, 1947. Okay. So he won Miss America around 1948, I believe, either 47 or 48. So this would have been around the time that he won Miss America. Maybe 47. He won Mr. USA, I think, the year after that. So around that time. And this was a pre-competition routine. So something that's very important to note with these pre-competition routines, and I think we may have covered one of these before, maybe from Clancy Ross, but maybe I'm wrong there. I can't quite remember. These pre-competition routines tended to be higher volumes. So they did use them to an extent as part of their conditioning up to stage. So what you tend to see is these routines have more sets. Sometimes they would even do 2-a-days and things like that. And then post-competition, usually they would have a bit of time off to recover, and then they would go back to more manageable volumes. So there is slightly higher volume here than some of the other plans we've talked about, and it is certainly higher than the plan that he outlined a few years later, and that might be some context as to why. Now, he also does not specify repetitions in this plan. He just tells us exercises and sets. The Silver Era guys, they weren't sort of that massive on repetitions necessarily. They sort of often gave like a 5 to 10 or something like that. And a lot of the stuff that Steve talked about elsewhere was kind of that 5 to 10 double progression method. So I'm assuming it was probably done in a similar format here with about, 5 to 10 double progression. So we begin with a wide grip bench, which we've seen before. We've talked about a few plans that have this wide grip bench. We touched on it a little bit last week as well in our podcast about why you would do a wide grip over sort of a maybe narrow or more standard grip. So he did 3 sets of a wide grip bench. Now, there's a lot of pressing in this one, Chris. He then went into an incline press, which he tended to do with a fairly steep incline. I believe he was doing standing incline. We've talked about that standing incline contraption before, and it looks like it's about a 45. And then he did 3 sets of that as well. And then he went into 2 sets of a dumbbell shoulder press. Now, in the images I've seen of Steve doing the shoulder press, he does tend to do them more frontal plane. This is with dumbbells. And then he goes into those 2 sets, in case I forgot to say that. And then he goes into 2 sets of a dumbbell front raise. We've got another pressing exercise. He then goes into 2 sets of a curl and press. Now, I'm kind of glad to see this exercise fell out of favor because it seems a bit silly perhaps, but it was a biceps curl into a shoulder press. I believe the shoulder press was done with that supinated grip of the biceps curl, done with dumbbells. And then we go into a pull up behind the neck. So you'll be once again happy to see that. We've got 3 sets of that into a seated close grip cable row. 3 sets of that. So we've got 3 sets of the frontal plane pull up and then 3 sets of a sagittal plane row and then 2 sets of a French press, 2 sets of a flat triceps dumbbell extension, like a lying extension. And how is this? We've got 6 sets of an incline bench curl, which is an interesting exercise selection, and we might touch on that. And then we've got 4 sets of squats, 4 sets of leg curls, and 4 sets of like a toe press on a leg press. And then finally, we've got 2 sets of a Roman chair good morning, which was basically a back extension. What do you make of all of that? That was, I believe that was like a 45 back extension. Someone can double check that on me, but in my mind, that's the image I'm seeing.
Cool. There's so much good about this program. I mean, from an exercise selection point of view, like that sort of selection of pressing exercises at the beginning, the wide grip bench, fantastic. We've got, all 3 regions of the pecs getting work there. The incline press tends to be a little bit more sort of sagittal plane, doesn't it? They tend to kind of move.
Generally, they are using dumbbells and usually doing a little bit more sagittal plane. I have seen photos of Steve using a bit of a wider grip, so I don't know if he mixed it up a little bit, but generally you would expect with a lot of the way these lifters were doing it, it was more sagittal plane.
Yeah, so then you've kind of got a bit more, clavicular pec, and depending on the angle, you might start to see anterior delt getting used a bit more in that one as well.
Steve had a very strong incline press. And so some of those photos are where he's like pushing the load a bit,
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely a bit more anterior delt in there. And then with the dumbbell shoulder press in the frontal plane, obviously much more middle delt. So, we can see this kind of tendency in those pressing exercises to focus on different
Mm,
muscle group, which is very, very cool. Front raise, I'm not a fan. I think it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me as an exercise. I think it's very unstable. But again, clavicular pec focus, a bit of anterior delt as well. Curl and press probably falls into the same category, I would say. If you're doing them in a sagittal plane, you're going to get pretty much the same effect as a front raise, maybe with a bit more anterior delt, a bit less clavicular pec, because you're not really, you're kind of getting the weight to that top point without so much, focus on the lower part of the motion from a delt perspective. But, it's not a great exercise, as you were saying. But broadly speaking, those pressing exercises seem to be selected in order
yeah.
to move the focus from one prime mover as we would see them. Like we say, the prime movers in pressing exercises, the pecs, the delts, and the kind of triceps. It looks like they're kind of trying to move the prime movers around a little bit to focus on different things, which is
Mm.
great. Pulling exercises, I wonder whether this is the very first program that actually has a complete set of back exercises, because we
And it's an
actually
early
have
one as well, 1947.
sagittal plane row, which is perfect, and we have a wide grip pull down, which is again perfect. So you've got the narrow grip row for the kind of upper lats, and you've got the kind of wide grip pull down for the lower lats. So fantastic. Okay, fine. Maybe there's not, and of course the row is doing your sort of posterior delts as well. So,
Mm.
with the exception of maybe saying, well, there's not much trap in there. Okay, fine, there's not much traps in here. But, other than that, it's a pretty cool back work. Triceps, again, when you say French press, to me, that sounds like you make a coffee. But like when you say French press, it's like, are we talking about, yeah, okay. So we're talking about something that is a sort of overhead triceps extension, basically. And then
Yeah.
kind of following that up with sort of a lying triceps extension,
Yes, I
flat.
believe that was done lying. Yeah. So very similar exercise, one's seated,
So
one's
that
lying.
really, I would say that's probably a bit of a letdown, because, if he'd kind of gone maybe to a standing triceps push down, then, you know, that would start to actually create a bit of a different effect for me. I think, you know, only 90 degrees shoulder angle difference between the two is probably not enough. I would want 180, or not 180, but close enough to 180 degrees to make it really kind of target different parts of the triceps. But again, moving in the right direction. It's not bad. It's not like when I read bodybuilding, sort of one of the old bodybuilding magazine, from the 80s, and they've got 7 different biceps curls, and they're all biomechanically identical, just using different equipment. And I'm like, that's not really what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to do is get biomechanically different exercises to work different, regions or even different muscles of a group. In terms of the biceps curl stuff, incline bench is really interesting. Obviously it's not done with a cable, so you're not getting, genuine kind of peak efforts at the bottom position. Like, ideally we would do if we wanted to kind of maximize biceps brachii. But, it is interesting in and of itself as an exercise selection. You combine that with the curl and press, which I assume was kind of more vertical standard biceps curl position. Maybe again, there's a little bit of kind of sort of difference there that's big enough to create an effect. Again, it wouldn't be my preference to pair those two exercises,
With
but
this
again, it's probably
incline curl, he also performed them. I think he invented this idea, this way of doing this, is my understanding at least, where the incline bench he would get a bar, a metal bar, and attach it to the back of this incline bench. So he had I guess like a support for his upper arms. So he still had his arms behind him, but he was, I guess,
okay.
more stable when he was doing it, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's always the issue with the incline bench curl, is that you kind of end up sort of doing shoulder movement while you're doing the curl. And I'm not sure I think that's probably why we see some weird data coming out with, sometimes you get, it's like, I think there's a couple of studies showing proximal biceps region growth, and it's like, well, hang on a minute, how is that happening? That's only going to happen from shoulder flexion, really. So I think there's some weirdnesses in the literature around that. But yeah, the point I'm making here is simply that, there's two biomechanically sort of different curl exercises. Again, like the triceps, I don't think they're biomechanically different enough to really be optimal, but you can see that they're moving in the right direction. In terms of leg stuff, not really seeing an enormous amount of. I mean, the hamstrings actually. No, I should correct myself. The hamstrings is interesting because I literally had this question on Instagram, and people were saying, what hamstrings exercises are sufficient, for a training program. I'm like, well, really, I would want 3 if I was kind of looking for a, perfect program for a competitive bodybuilder. I'd be looking for seated leg curl, lying leg curl, and 45-degree back extension, because I think that kind of gives you everything, literally everything. But if you're looking at general population, and funnily, I said in my story, I just wrote Gen Pop because that's just kind of how we talk. When you're talking about general population, you're talking to other researchers, or you're talking to people who are reading literature, you just say Gen Pop because everybody knows what you mean. But apparently, my audience don't know what I mean. So I wrote Gen Pop in this comment, and I had a ton of these messages of people saying, "Who or what is a Gen Pop?" Okay, fine. So the vernacular doesn't translate very well. But anyway, but yeah, for general population, I think you probably could get away with 2 of those 3, and it would be most of what you would want. But here we've got obviously leg curls and probably a 45-degree back extension, which again is a fantastic combination for getting most of the way there in terms of hamstrings development. And then in terms of quads, obviously we've just got squats, but that. No, we talked before about the knee extension problem. It's unless you've got the equipment or you're prepared to cobble together some kind of iron boot or some other strange kind of equipment, you're probably limited with rec fem training. We have seen people in the silver era doing leg raises to train the proximal part of the rec fem, which is totally fine, totally cool. But you're not going to get the distal part of the rec fem, which is the kind of bit that makes the quad look the way it does. Or to a certain extent, we're not going to get that without some sort of knee extension. Does that kind of, sort of sissy squat do that? I don't know. I mean, I'd love somebody to do some work on that one day, but, maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. I suppose it depends really on what the hip is doing in that situation. In terms of, again, something that came up in the questions for me yesterday on Instagram, people are still very confused about what antagonist inhibition is. So, there's this idea that still goes back to I remember when I first got into this space, people were saying, "Oh yeah, the hamstrings don't work in a squat because they don't change length." And people just repeated that. And it was like, you repeated that enough times and people just believed it. And it's like, that's absolutely not what's going on at all. Changing length is irrelevant. We've got some really nice isometric studies showing that if you're contracting the hip extensors isometrically, then the rec fem and the hamstrings switch off if you've also got knee extension isometric contractions going on. So you do your knee extension contraction on its own with, isometric 90-degree contraction, and you've got lots of rec fem activation, lots of the other quadriceps activation. As soon as you add on any kind of hip extension isometric on top of that, the rectus femoris drops out completely. Now you can do the same thing, in other exercises as well. But the fundamental is that the antagonist inhibition effect works when you have a hip extension force at the same time as a knee extension force, at least as far as talking about the hamstrings or the rec fem is concerned. And this works pretty much for most 2-joint muscles. Now it's got nothing to do with movement. So if you're doing a sissy squat and you've actually got some kind of hip extension force going on, then what you're going to find is that the rectus femoris drops out. It doesn't have to be moving. So really what it comes down to is what the balance looks like and whether or not you're creating a hip extension taut to keep that position. If you're not, then fine. But if you are, then I'm kind of a bit skeptical about whether it would work the way that people think it works. And I'm not saying it doesn't. I'm just saying
We
it's
just don't
not
know.
about movement. But I don't know. It's like, I'm always skeptical about that kind of expression, "We don't know." It's like, well, who's this "we" and
Yeah.
who is speaking for "we"? But
Yeah,
I
it's like
don't.
when someone says there's no studies that show this. It's like, well, as far as there's no
No
study. Yeah,
studies show
exactly.
that. And that happens to me. I mean, as you know, I've been diving into a whole new area of research that I've not spent a lot of time looking at before, and trying to figure out how some of these physiological things work in that area. And, I've been surprised by just how much work had been done in a particular area
Mm.
by actually the same laboratory. And I just I knew of, say, 2 or 3 of their studies, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, I'm aware of that they've done some work in that area, and it's peripherally interesting to me, but I haven't gone into that because it's just not my core area." Anyway, I went in this last week, and they've done, 15 studies. I mean, there's just tons and tons of work on that stuff that I just didn't know about. And it's like, I'm probably, as far as candidates go for people who've read the most sports science literature in the world. I'm probably pretty high up on that list. Now, and I didn't know about those studies. So it happens to all of us,
Yeah.
absolutely happens to us. So I don't think we can say that, I wouldn't want to be one of those people who, there is no study showing this. Well, I don't think there's a study showing this.
Yeah. Yeah.
We tend to use the word we a little bit too kind of broadly.
No, I think that's a really good point. Even like for me, I'm normally careful when I say there's no studies. I would
Yeah,
normally only say that when it's a topic that I've like exhausted and I'm so confident
yeah,
in that thing.
yeah,
And
exactly.
I actually had a moment last week, totally separate to this, but something, so obviously a lot of my work is more functional health. And one area of functional health that I know quite well is endometriosis. So female condition, health condition. And I feel like I'm pretty aware of basically all the studies to do with like, say, supplementation and endometriosis. Like I've spent endless amounts of times looking at this. And I found this study last week from like 2021 or something. Like it's not even a new study. And what they'd done is the supplement had been called a different name. So
Right.
sometimes the
Yeah.
supplement used a different name. And for some, like, I don't know how I hadn't found it under endo. And I feel like it just got buried by PubMed and did like the SEO must have been so bad because I don't know that anyone's seen this because I've never seen anyone talk about this. So that's interesting. But my whole point here is even when you think you know something inside and out, you might actually still be missing something. So we should be a little bit,
Totally.
or ideally be a bit more careful, I guess, with how we present some of
Yeah,
that
no,
stuff.
absolutely. So we were talking about, I think, antagonist inhibition idea and whether or not it applies in sissy squats. And I was just saying I don't know if it does. And I mean, I think there probably is a way of doing them that does avoid it. Does everybody avoid it in every time they do them? Probably not. So it's just kind of, but again, I don't know of any data that's really looked at that very well. And I'm very skeptical of EMG studies in the quads because you tend to get a lot of crosstalk between the rectus femoris and the other quadriceps muscles unless you're using fine wire or being extremely careful. A number of studies I've seen where people have said, "Oh no, look, we've got all this rectus femoris activation in the squat," and I'm like, "Okay, well, why does the rect fem never grow then, ever after squats?" I think there's maybe one study showing a little bit of rect fem growth after squats. And pretty much all the others don't show that. So, I think it's basically crosstalk that we're seeing in those EMG studies. But yeah, so overall, that was my perspective on the program. I really, really like it. I think there's loads there that's really good. Shows very, very good understanding of biomechanical differences producing different regional hypertrophy effects. A couple of differences that I would I mean, obviously, I would just take out the front raise, I'd take out the curl and press, and I would tweak, and I'd probably and I would probably cut the incline bench curls volume in half and kind of use a totally different bicycle exercise to supplement that. And, I'd probably tweak the triceps exercises a bit, but the rest of it, I love it. I think it's really, really good program. What I mean? And that really just, I get bored of saying this, but these guys are writing better programs than 99% of what we see on the internet today.
Yeah, exactly. From an exercise selection standpoint, like you said, there's a few tweaks you would make, but by and large,
Very, very good. Very,
it's
very
very
good.
solid. Yeah.
Very, very good.
Now, today we're going to jump back to the thing I introduced at the start about how Reg and Steve talk about using juice and using honey and adding this into your intra workout. And even, I mean, they talk about it at other times of the day as well, but they specifically say intra workout, this is going to be particularly beneficial. And there's actually research on this, isn't there?
Yeah. So I think kind of going back a little bit in time, in endurance sports and also in soccer to a certain extent, there was a tendency or a research area that involved what's called carbohydrate mouth rinsing. So basically, it would be like a sports drink. They tend to use 6% maltodextrin, and it's a very, very common kind of sports drink that you'd be able to get hold of in most shops. And rather than actually drinking it, they would just swirl it around the mouth, spit it out. And it's usually about 10, 20 seconds just before or a little bit before the activity. And it shows surprising effects, or it showed surprisingly positive effects in those kind of sporting activities of more endurance type exercise. And then in the last kind of sort of 5 or 10 years, we've seen that body of research move over into strength training. So in fact, so much so that now we actually have, I was kind of surprised to see just how much literature there was now, but there's actually a meta-analysis of about 11 or 12, maybe even 13 individual studies in strength training, and the balance of the kind of the data in the meta-analysis showed that, it has a positive effect in strength training as well as in the endurance exercise. So, basically, this is really, really important because it shows that supraspinal central nervous system fatigue is happening as a matter of course in strength training workouts. That's hopefully no surprise to people who've been following my work for the last couple of years, but the general kind of sort of belief in a lot of the science section of the fitness industry is that supraspinal CNS fatigue is not really a thing. The general perception is that you can kind of just push harder and try harder and it'll go away. And I'll come on to that concept later on. But ultimately, what this is showing is that because the carbohydrate can't have a peripheral effect because you're not consuming it, it has to be working through a sort of central nervous system effect. Your brain detects it and then obviously doesn't recognize the fact that you spit it out instead of actually consumed it. But, it recognizes it and it then changes something that allows you to then perform more repetitions, usually 1.5 or so more repetitions per sort of batch of sets that you're doing, which is, an extra 1.5 stimulating reps. The point I'm making is that what I really like about this area of data, this area of research, is that it demonstrates unequivocally that we are getting supraspinal CNS fatigue happening in a workout, and that part of that CNS fatigue is, or part of that supraspinal CNS fatigue is related to the body detecting reductions in the storage of carbohydrate or blood glucose or whatever. And it's obviously then the carbohydrate malference is changing that. And of course, we can now link that back to what you were saying about the silver era, whereby, okay, fine, the honey and the orange juice was being consumed and not spat out, but it's still going to have the same effect in terms of, sort of alleviating that supraspinal CNS.
So walk us through how you're arriving to the fact that this is demonstrating supraspinal CNS fatigue. And maybe, I know we've covered supraspinal CNS fatigue a lot, so maybe just like in a really small nutshell, in case this is a new term to anyone, if you could summarize what that is.
Yeah. So let me divide that into two parts. Let me just very quickly describe what supraspinal central nervous system fatigue is, and then secondly, let me explain how it connects to carbohydrate, glucose, glycogen, and stuff like that. So first things first, the concept of supraspinal central nervous system fatigue essentially goes back to Marcora's psychobiological model of fatigue. So what Marcora says, and what he showed through a series of experiments, is that every time we're doing any kind of activity, we're producing a central motor command that is switching on motor units. It's the motor unit recruitment signal that starts in the motor cortex. And every time you produce that, you feel a perception of effort associated with that signal. And essentially, that perception of effort has a maximum limit to it. We call it the maximum tolerable perception of effort. So as you increase force production or effort in a movement, what you're going to find is that your effort and your motor unit recruitment levels go up together. And at a certain point, you hit a maximum tolerable limit. You can't go beyond that because by definition, it's the maximum tolerable limit. And so you stop. And you can't create any more motor unit recruitment. But if you have any other sensation of discomfort going on, I mean, I've joked before, you can do this literally in any scenario. I mean, somebody actually asked me a question on Instagram and I said, look, you could do a number of different experiments around this. I mean, one of my favorites is actually was invented, but proposed by one of my mentorship clients a while back. And he said, well, I could do biceps curls in a seated position on a chair, or I could do biceps curls like in a wall sit position. And I'm going to get greater effort perception from the wall sit than I would from sitting on the chair. And so I'd expect to get fewer repetitions doing the biceps curls in the wall sit versus the chair. Fantastic experiment. And you can do a bunch of other things. I mean, you can literally just have somebody poke you with a stick. It's like that would create pain and discomfort. And that would, again, bring you close to your maximum tolerable perception of effort. Of course, not allowing motor unit recruitment to get as high as it would do if you weren't suffering that pain and discomfort. So the whole point about the Marcora's model is that he says, if you've got no other pain and discomfort, then your motor unit recruitment levels will get to their highest possible level at your maximum tolerable perception of effort. If you have other effort perceptions going on because you've got this, discomfort from the wall sit, or you do a run before you do your biceps curl, or you've got somebody poking you with a stick, or it doesn't really matter, any discomfort that's going on, that's still present when you're trying to reach your maximum level of motor unit recruitment, you're not going to reach your maximum level of recruitment because your total amount of effort perception now is comprised of, say, 90% recruitment-related signal and 10% being poked with a stick signal. or whatever it may be, discomfort from breathing hard, or, the sitting position that you're in,
I
or
mean, this is
anything
why
else.
we see those studies where they do like social media, like someone will scroll social media before a strength training workout and there'll be a reduction. So there's like cognitive
That's
effort.
cognitive load. It's the experience of feeling like, kind of this effort that you've put into dealing with something discomforting. I mean, you can create discomfort in a human being in a billion different ways. I mean, we're really good at detecting things that bother us, So, I mean, you can have all kinds of things that bother people, and as I say, I joke about poking with a stick, but, it's like it could be, as you say, something unpleasant that you've seen on social media, or just something that's, sucked energy out of your brain that you've been devoting to thinking about. The point is that it's a source of discomfort that you're now tolerating, and that's now occupying space in the area of effort perception that brings you closer to your maximum tolerable perception of effort. So the more stuff you've got like that, the further away from your true maximum level of recruitment you reach at maximum effort perception. And that's the really important thing, because I think sometimes people go, well, I'll just try harder. I'm like, no, you won't. You'll still reach the same maximum level of effort perception. You're still trying exactly as hard as you possibly can. The point is that you're trying hard and you're now dealing with other stuff inside of that bracket of things that includes you trying hard. And that's then suppressing your level of recruitment associated with that maximum effort perception. So you can't say, I'm just going to try harder, because you can't. There is stuff we can do to sort of address this issue, and that's what we're talking about today. But ultimately, in terms of Mark Rora's model, you reach your maximum tolerable perception of effort. That's it. That's the point where you reach muscular failure. Now, what level of recruitment you reach at that corresponds to that is a separate question. This is how supraspinal central nervous system fatigue works. Literally, how many other discomforting sensations are you dealing with at the same time as dealing with the discomforting kind of perception of motor recruitment itself? And the fewer of those things you're dealing with, the less supraspinal CNS fatigue you're going to have. So that's the first half of the answer to your question.
Yeah, great. And it's worth noting as well that that can be factors from within the workout, but they can also be carried over from before the workout,
Totally.
previous
I mean, like, if
workouts.
you've had an absolutely horrible journey to get to the gym, maybe like you missed the bus, and like, or you kind of got stuck in traffic, or there was some kind of accident on the way, or you worried about, like, another great one is like, if you've like sort of time pressure and you've got to finish the gym but then get out and then go to some other kind of commitment afterwards, it's like that's going to create issues for you. The entire kind of environment that you're in, whatever story your brain is creating, because ultimately this is all about your brain perceiving stuff, So yes, it can be genuinely physiological. It's like, yeah, if I've just run on, like if I do an experiment and I run on the treadmill for 5 minutes really quickly, and then I'm still breathing hard, and then I try and do biceps curls, you're not going to get the same number of reps out as if you hadn't done that, but that's genuinely physiological. Similarly, if I've got, like, if I do a really unpleasant set of calf raises and my, kind of, lots of high rep stuff, and my muscles are really hurting, and then I immediately try and do, biceps curls again, that metabolic accumulation, lactate and, phosphate and acidosis combination is going to create a pain in the muscle that is then going to, again, create problems for me when I'm doing the biceps curls, even though it's a completely different part of the body. But equally, the story that we tell ourselves in the brain, it's like watching too much social media just before the set, or, if you've got some kind of interpersonal interaction going on that's bothering you, like if you've got a queue of people trying to get on the machine after you, I mean, like, these things can all create issues for you if your brain perceives them to be discomforting, even if
I
they're not generally physiological.
I notice with my one-on-one clients who are more like, say, corporate clients, or, they work sort of high up in a sort of high stress situational job. I notice with them, there's a fairly high correlation with the amount of mental stress of their work and their performance in the gym. And that's irrespective of, whether their sleep is affected or their diet is affected. Like they can have the same routine, but they're just feeling more stressed out at work and the performance goes down. And often what we'll do then is maybe look at, do we train at different times of the day? Are you less stressed in the morning before your day at work? Yes, let's do that. But,
It's
certainly
mostly
it's,
about how much processing the brain is dedicating to the other stuff. So
mhm,
I would argue always that if you can capture them before they pick their
before they do
phone up
any
in
of
the
that.
morning,
Yeah.
you're going to get a really solid workout in, even if it's not ideal for other reasons.
Yeah.
You actually, before they get a chance to turn their phone on, or boot up their email, you want to get them then,
Yeah.
because as soon as they've got their head full of stuff relating to, whatever problems they're dealing with, you're not working with someone who's got full capacity to access, you know, um, Basically dedicate all of their effort perception to this motor unit Krumah signal. That's what we're saying. That's what you
Yes.
want to do. As soon as you're dedicating chunks of your effort perception to tolerating discomfort and problems in other parts of your life, then you're not going to be able to dedicate all of that effort perception to motor unit Krumah. I mean, I guess somebody who's more sociopathic and doesn't feel those things probably be more
Mm.
capable, but that's a separate question. But that's literally how supraspinal CNS works. It's literally just what the brain is tolerating in terms of discomfort and pain. And it can be physiological in the sense of, it could be hard lungs, kind of pain, burning sensation in the muscle. It could be DOMS from a previous workout. It can be genuinely physiological, as we would say, body related, but it can also absolutely and is often psychologically related in terms of tolerating this cognitive load of other stuff. But it all goes through the same process.
So, what do carbohydrates have to do with this?
So the really important thing is this goes back to the beginning of exercise science, actually. All the way back in the beginning, one of the first sets of research studies, investigations that were done were around fatigue in endurance type exercise. And the researchers noticed that, essentially, carbohydrate made a big difference to people's ability to perform long durations of endurance exercise. And if they start to dig into that, they notice that blood glucose and muscle glycogen and things like that would decrease over a couple of hours of cycling exercise. And interestingly, when they tested fatigue, as in maximum strength at various points in the cycling blocks of time, they would notice a correlation between the fatigue reductions in strength and these reductions in glucose in blood and glycogen in the muscles. This gave rise to what we now call the energy crisis hypothesis. Now, we're being rude when we say energy crisis. It's not kind of like, not rude, but like it's a pejorative expression, because they never really called it that at the beginning. But basically, energy crisis essentially means that you're running out of energy in the muscle, and the muscle kind of is fatiguing because it doesn't have access to energy. Now, we now know from decades of work on fatigue physiology that all fatigue mechanisms are actually trying to stop you doing that. They're trying to stop you running out of energy. So the whole concept of a fatigue mechanism is it doesn't allow you to run out. So ATP doesn't deplete the way people think it depletes. It absolutely pretty much stays the same level especially in strength training situations. We're not running out of ATP, but we can start to get low on glycogen in the muscle fibers and glucose in the bloodstream. So basically, the brain notices when glycogen starts to drop in the muscle or blood glucose starts to decrease, and it produces an increase in effort perception, discomfort associated with that. Anybody who's done a long bike ride and they've been sailing along at cruising pace for a period of time, and then suddenly they just kind of literally lose the ability to go any further, or not go any further, but their speed just tanks. That's a famous kind of experience that any long distance cyclist will have had at some point in their cycling career, and professional cyclists talk about it or have talked about it for decades. Is this moment, and I think to a certain extent, mountain runners might experience the same kind of thing. It's not something I know anything about, but it's this moment where your brain realizes that glycogen levels have dropped below a certain threshold, or glucose levels have dropped below a certain threshold, and it downregulates your ability to exercise by increasing massively your effort perception. Everything suddenly feels like you're trying to walk through treacle. That essentially is your brain noticing something physiologically, the low levels of glycogen or glucose, and it responds by increasing your effort perception accordingly to stop you from running out of ATP in the future, because running out of ATP is pretty pathological for muscle fibers. It doesn't want to do that. So to avoid it happening, it stops you from exercising at the same intensity by increasing effort perception. So, and as I say, you can sort of fool your brain into thinking that the carbohydrate levels are higher than they are by carbohydrate mouth rinsing. I mean, obviously, you can still just drink the carbohydrate as normal. You do that like the Silver Era bodybuilders are doing, but you don't have to if you don't want to. So for people who are maybe, just as a minor practical application, for people who may be very in a period of caloric restriction, they don't want to start throwing carbohydrates around as much as somebody who maybe not in a period of caloric restriction, then you could actually kind of cheat by looking at carbohydrate mouth rinsing. But that's not really the reason I want to talk about it today. I just want to talk about it as being a clear indicator that even in strength training workouts, despite them not being long endurance type exercise, they are still subjected to this supraspinal fatigue problem of the reducing levels of glycogen or glucose in the body that the brain then is producing an effort perception in response to. And as I was saying before we jumped on this podcast to do the recording, one of my favorite couple of studies in this area actually shows that you can get this effect even when you're just doing 5 or 6 sets of heavy load exercise. So that for me is really, really interesting because it's in this area, historically, if you go back to the beginning, generally speaking, the effect was originally studied in the bigger, longer duration endurance type activities. People like, and honestly, supraspinal fatigue plays a massive role in endurance exercise, much bigger than it does in strength training. Like, I know people kind of still have this crazy idea that, kind of heavy strength training is the CNS fatigue inducer. It's not. It's the opposite way around. The bigger, the
Mm.
longer the duration, the lower the intensity of the exercise, the more the CNS fatigue, the supraspinal CNS fatigue you're going to get. Which is why performances at that endurance end of the spectrum are so modifiable by circumstance and attitude. David Goggins has done an amazing job of just showing people that how you perceive an endurance event is probably 80% of what your performance is going to look like. And that's because it's 80% CNS fatigue. So, yeah. But the important thing is that carbohydrate mouth rinsing has an effect even when you're doing like 5 or 6 sets of heavy loads. Well, that means that every single workout that all of us are doing at the moment is being affected by CNS fatigue. No matter how science-based we are, no matter how low volume we are, or maybe there's a limit somewhere, but ultimately, if I'm probably one of the lowest volume lifters at the moment out there. I'm literally doing almost nothing. I maybe do kind of 10 or 12 sets total in a workout, a bunch of different exercises. I am still probably suffering that effect. Once you go over 5 or 6 sets, you're probably in that territory where you're into super spot. Well, you're definitely in that territory where you're getting that effect.
So how does this tie into fasting? So if someone's in a fasted state or not in a fasted state, say they ate carbohydrates that morning, they're training in the afternoon or whatever it might be, does that influence the effect of this?
I don't know. That's a really interesting point. I mean, I think we were looking at the meta-analysis together a while back, and we were looking at how the researchers, I think they found no effect, didn't they? They found no effect of
In the strength
fasting
training,
in that
yeah, the
in the strength
endurance they
training
did.
situation. But yeah. So I think there's probably a lot to be said about relative changes. I think obviously strength training is going to burn through glucose and glycogen a lot more quickly because of the higher intensity of the exercise and the fast-twitch fiber involvement. So I suspect it's a relative change thing primarily, but obviously, as you say, they're finding it in the endurance activity area. So, maybe it's also an absolute thing. But in terms of strength training, I suspect it's the relative change that matters more. So if you suddenly drop a large chunk of, glucose or glycogen in various parts of the body, wherever the brain is looking, then you might suddenly trigger the effect. But yeah, in terms, but just going back to the meta-analysis, I think when they're talking about fasting, I think they're really talking about up to 12 hours. I think
I think so.
overnight fasting was the maximum they did. I don't think we're into territory where people are actually kind of no. So this would be relevant then for somebody who eats normally in the evenings and then gets up and does a workout before breakfast. Perhaps that would be the kind of scenario we could imagine it would apply. But if somebody's saying, well, no, I'm actually following an intermittent fasting scenario where I'm only eating in the evening or something like that, then I would say that this probably is not relevant for you. The data doesn't give you what you want to know. So like if you're going to, eat in the evening and then do a workout just before eating the following evening, nearly 24 hours of fasting, I would say the data probably don't exist to tell you how that would interact in this scenario. But honestly, I would, given that we're seeing this effect even with minimal fasting, I would say that pretty much everybody is being affected by this,
In clients that I have who do train fasted, so they have the normal dinner, sleep, and then go to the gym before breakfast, what I generally get them to do is have, normally I'd say like honey and coffee, right? And I actually try to get them to have a fair bit of honey because you deplete a fair bit of liver glycogen overnight. And my sort of thinking with that, and this is just my speculation, is that if we could top up liver glycogen, it might make blood glucose a little bit more stable and maybe prevent some of these fatigue mechanisms you're talking about. And I also wonder, well, in that situation, if, consuming honey 20 minutes, half an hour, whatever, before the training session, what's the proximity have to be to that training session
Well,
for the
that's
carbohydrate?
the great thing. That's the great thing about these carbohydrate mouth rinsing studies, because they're literally doing it almost immediately before the
Mm.
workout in some cases. Not all of them. Some of them are giving an hour or so, but there's a big chunk of
So,
them
so
that
an
just.
hour or so before it's still having an effect?
So it doesn't seem to make that. At least they didn't see it identified as a moderating variable in the
Okay.
meta-analysis. So as far as I can tell, it doesn't seem to make that big a deal. But logically, you would, kind of, given that the brain seems to be capable of detecting it instantaneously,
Mm,
I naturally would just say, well, why don't you just do it, as you're
closer to
walking
it.
into the gym? So I think the interesting thing is that it is capable of having that effect in that moment. So the brain is instantaneously adjusting its effort perception accordingly in response to that signal. So,
Mm,
but as I say, it's happening even with relatively short fasting periods. So, as said before, I think all of us are probably experiencing this problem to some degree. We're all probably getting this kind of negative effect, whereby we could potentially fix it by using either a sports drink to drink or to do carbohydrate methods, which is very, very interesting because it tells us we're actually missing out something here.
yeah. Yeah, like you said, like, all of us could be doing this. For me, like I said, I normally have my juice, and I normally combine honey with it and have that with me, and, like you said, if someone calorically can
Yeah,
can
they don't
afford
have
to
to
do that.
actually consume it. I mean, this is the cool thing. I mean, I remember actually when somebody consulted with me a few years back, and they had a bunch of clients who were just trying to avoid excessive, what they felt was excessive carbohydrate consumption. And I don't comment on nutritional stuff at all. It's not something I know anything about. And I was like, well, just use carbohydrate mouth rinsing then, if that's something that you want to avoid. So I think pretty much everybody, no matter what their preferences or tendencies or practices are in terms of nutrition, could actually use this either by consuming the carbohydrate if that fits in their, you know, sort of personal nutritional requirements or preferences, actually just not consuming it if they don't want to. I mean, it's like, as long as you've got somewhere to dispose of of the carbohydrate that you just mouth rinsed with, you should be fine. So, that's I just think, practically is an interesting thing, but fundamentally it just underpins how big of an effect the supraspinal fatigue problem is, even in strength training context. I mean, we always knew it was a massive deal in the context of endurance activities, as I said, demonstrated by people like David Goggins, who've shown us, just how important the brain and mind is in endurance type activity. So it is important in strength training as well.
I do want to follow that thread a little bit further in just a moment, but I want to make sure everyone leaves this knowing how to do the carbohydrate mastering thing if they want to do it. So in these studies, they're generally doing like 10 to 20 seconds or thereabouts, aren't they? I guess one question would be, what if someone were not to swish it in their mouth for 10 or 20 seconds, if they were just to actually consume their sports drink or their juice and honey or whatever? Is that still likely to have a similar effect? Do we even have enough data to answer that at all?
That's going into territory that I probably haven't looked at. I mean, ultimately, I look at stuff that is relevant to my area of expertise, and you're starting to go into nutritional stuff really at this point. My expectation would be that it would work exactly the same way. I think that the body is hypersensitive to the presence of carbohydrate. The brain is not going to miss it. I mean, if you think about it, the brain is trying to identify. In fact, we're cheating things by doing the mouth rinsing stuff. I mean, that's the important. The brain is expecting you to consume this stuff, and it's expecting to see it as it's being consumed. So my expectation is that, yeah, if you consume it, that will create the same effect as if you mouth rinsed it. I think the mouth rinsing stuff is us trying to cheat the system a little bit and make the brain respond to something that's not real. So I think honestly, if you were to have the same bottle and you were to mouth rinse one bottle and throw the other, and to actually just drink the other one, I think you'll get pretty much the same effects. In fact, my expectation is you would probably logically get a better effect from drinking it. But I don't know that for a fact because I don't think there's any data showing that. So, but yeah, I don't think the brain would miss it just because you consumed it. That seems the opposite way around to me.
And is there anything relevant to the taste or the sweetness? Like, when I first heard about this, my assumption was, oh, is this like a reward mechanism? Is this a positive experience? It likes the sweetness. And is that having an effect on the supraspinal CNS fatigue? And it seems like
No,
that's
so
what
there's definitely where they've used flavor controlled placebos. So no, it's not.
interesting. So, look, there's probably not much more people need to know. It's fairly
Well,
straightforward.
I mean, there's nothing really more to say about the carbohydrate mouth rinsing thing, but I think
Yeah.
it's useful just to link this to something that again we've been talking about recently, which is this
Yes.
idea of, coming back to Marcora's model. Marcora's model, the simple version that we've talked about so far, basically has maximum levels of maximum tolerable perception of effort corresponding to, either, if in the perfect scenario, maximum motor improvement, or a lower level of motor neuron plus a bunch of discomforting sensations. And that's kind of the simple version of the model. Complicated version of the model, not hugely complicated, but just one extra feature, is that you can moderate your maximum tolerable perception of effort slightly by various strategies because your degree of motivation at any one moment in time just nudges upwards or downwards that level of maximum tolerable effort. So what I'm saying is you are prepared to tolerate more pain because you are motivated. That's it. Or you are less prepared to tolerate as much pain because you're not motivated. So you've got this motivation thing that modifies things a little bit. So what that means is that if you are suffering for some reason, and we were just talking about this again recently, like say, for example, you have a really bad night of sleep, you're essentially sleep deprived or at least restricted in the amount of sleep you've had, you're going to be experiencing an elevated level of pain sensitivity. And so you're going to find that your maximum tolerable perception effort comes down. If, on the other hand, you then experience something motivating, you can bump that back up again. So you've kind of changed things and you've done those things. So ultimately, all the time, whenever we're talking about this stuff, whether it's the carbohydrate, mouth rinsing stuff, whether it's motivation from people around you working in the gym with you, or whether it's loud music or any of these things that are changing our motor recruitment, they're all working within Marcora's psychobiological model of fatigue. It's really just either putting in or removing other perceptions, or it's slightly adjusting the level of motor recruitment. Slightly adjusting the level of motivation. And all of that's going to impact on motor recruitment.
I mean, it's a bucket analogy, really, isn't it? You can make the bucket bigger or you can take things out of that bucket.
Exactly. The more we do when we're trying, so like, for example, you've got a lifter and you're like, okay, so we're going to use some carbohydrate mouth rinsing. We're also going to maybe give them a cup of coffee to put some caffeine in them. And then we're also going to play loud music and have a bunch of people working at the same time as them. And like all of these things that you do are all basically through very, very slightly different mechanisms, but ultimately the same ultimate model, are working to increase the level of motor recruitment you can achieve, either by removing sensations of discomfort or by increasing motivation. But you probably can't stack them linearly the way that you might expect, because ultimately the kind of increases in motor recruitment get harder and harder and harder as you add more and more motivation or remove more and more of the discomforting sensations. Like, if you were to say, well, the first thing that you do, let's say you first thing you do is just test a little bit of carbohydrate mouth rinsing, you might see a pretty big effect. And then if you test a cup of coffee, you might get a slightly incremental effect that's still there, but not as big. But if you were to do it the other way around, you'd see the opposite effect. The caffeine would be the big effect, and then the carbohydrate mouth rinsing would be the smaller effect. It's just because whatever you did first or tested first would be the bigger impact, because you've got more capacity to do something when you're starting from a bigger deficit. And the closer you get to your true ultimate maximum that you're physiologically capable of, the smaller the increments are going to be. So I think it probably is a kind of a sort of a non-linear effect when you start adding this stuff. So what I think people are going to find is that if they go, well, I'm already really pumped when I go into my workout, I've got a bunch of people I train with, have this amazing gym and really loud music, and I always, get my coffee before I go in. I'm like, well, do I think you're going to see a big effect from carbohydrate mouth rinsing? Probably not.
Do you think, though, I would imagine all of those motivational techniques are probably going to have more overlap than, say, something like the carbohydrate mouth rinsing, which is not working off motivation, right? So if someone's got like two motivational techniques that they're stacking, and they're like, do I do another motivational thing or do I do the carbohydrates? I'd be thinking, do the carbohydrates.
I think your instincts are probably right. Ultimately, I don't know. Ultimately, the model is going to give you the same effects of these things. But you're right. Maybe the two things can be separated into the two categories. Like, are you removing a discomforting sensation or are you increasing motivation? I mean, like, the carbohydrate mouth rinsing is really interesting because it genuinely does remove a discomforting sensation that we're suffering from. So it falls in the same category of things like changing your workout structure to avoid high repetitions and to leave longer rest periods, and those things that are taking out discomfort, and so that's separate then. You're going to measure the same impact of these things, but as you say, qualitatively, they are fundamentally different in the approach that you're taking to get to the output. So yeah, I mean, like, on the motivational side, there definitely is going to be a diminishing returns effect of adding more motivational stuff. So you've already got loud music plus friends. How much more can you really get out of some of the other motivational stuff? Probably not much. But if you, as you say, then supplement that with something that is more down the removal of the discomfort side of things, then potentially that does have capacity to be more interesting. But again, And this is all stuff that people would be looking at if they would just use Mark Aura's model in this context. And I think one of my great frustrations with the research around all of these things in the moment in exercise science is that they're not using Mark Aura's model, because Mark Aura's model is primarily, not exclusively, but primarily looked at in endurance activities. And people aren't really using it as much in strength training, even though he's literally got studies of strength training shown.
Okay, I've got one final question for you. You've been talking a little bit about creatine lately. People may have seen this in your stories and your posts a little bit. And you've mentioned that creatine can increase the number of repetitions that one is capable of doing. Now, you've also just mentioned here that the carbohydrates have been associated with about a repetition increase, give or take. Now, here you're saying that equals more hypertrophy, and the creatine you're
Yes.
saying that doesn't. And in case someone's like, well, hang on, that's inconsistent. It's not actually inconsistent. Why?
So basically, you've got two separate mechanisms which are producing fatigue that are being affected by these two compounds. So when we look at the effects of carbohydrate, we are affecting the supraspinal CNS fatigue. So if I alleviate supraspinal CNS fatigue, I can get higher levels of recruitment. So I can access more motor units, there's more muscle fibers, and I get more hypertrophy. If I use the creatine, then I'm not doing that. I'm not increasing the level of motor unit recruitment, at least not within workout. I mean, we can argue about whether it changes things in the post-workout period, that's separate. But in the context of the workout itself, I'm not changing the level of motor unit recruitment. All I'm doing is delaying the onset of metabolite-related fatigue. Metabolite-related fatigue is irrelevant for hypertrophy. Ultimately, all it does is slow down the muscle fiber shortening velocity. So if anything, it actually helps you. The absence of metabolite fatigue is not going to be something that's beneficial. So all that's happening is I just delay. So what you can look at it as basically like the use of a carbohydrate mouth rinse will add reps on the stimulating rep zone, whereas the creatine will add reps on the bit before you enter the stimulating rep zone. So you're just delaying the onset of the stimulating rep zone.
Yeah. Are you adding rep at the end or at the start of the set?
In many ways, it's the same thing that we see in training situations. So if I'm using, say, for example, light load strength training to failure, and I start to, kind of notice that my number of reps per set is really, really going up very rapidly, I'm gaining, progressive overload is happening extremely fast, then one of the mechanisms by which that can happen is that I become better capable of tolerating the pain associated with those burning sensations in the muscles. Now, by doing that, I'm actually increasing the level of recruitment at muscular failure, and I'm going to find that each workout that I do over the course of that time, as that adaptation is happening, is going to become more stimulating over time, because I'm accessing. Now, I'm never going to get to quite the level as I would do with heavy load, but it's
Yes.
going to move in that direction. So I'm going to find that I gradually start to improve my ability to create stimulus from those workouts. Conversely, if I look at, say, for example, changes in fatigue resistance inside the muscle fibers that are happening with the light load strength training to failure, and what's going to happen is that I start to develop the ability to resist metabolite related fatigue. And again, I'm going to add more reps and my progressive overload is going to go crazy. And I'm going to see, but that's not going to change the amount of hypertrophy stimulus I get from the workout. So you actually get both of those adaptations happening in the context of light load strength training to failure programs, one of which is actually giving you more stimulating reps, one which is not giving you more stimulating reps, just both of them. And you end up adding, this is why light load strength training to failure adds volume load in just incredible quantities over the course of a training program. You end up with really high volume loads at the end of the program compared to what you had at the beginning, because your muscular endurance changes so much. And it's because it's attacking multiple fatigue mechanisms or creating resistance to multiple fatigue mechanisms, some of which are helpful, some of which are essentially irrelevant. And you get exactly the same thing.
Yeah, great. Yeah. I think that answers it perfectly. Okay. I think that's everything we needed to cover. Is there anything else you want to mention?
No, I'm good.
Okay. Don't forget to keep an eye out for your up and coming podcast in the next week or two. And please, as always, join us again for another episode next week.